The first thing Sadie felt wasn't the blinding Nevada sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, nor was it the pounding headache threatening to split her skull. It was the weight. A heavy, cold, terrifyingly perfect 6-carat diamond ring sitting on her left hand. She gasped, rolling over in the unfamiliar sea of black silk sheets, only to freeze. A man was sitting in the velvet armchair across the penthouse suite, casually sipping a black espresso. He was the stranger from the airplane, the cold, untouchable stranger she had accidentally fallen asleep on. Beside his porcelain saucer rested a golden, legally binding marriage certificate and a loaded Glock 19. Chicago's O'Hare International Airport at 11:45 p.m. was a desolate wasteland of delayed flights, spilled coffee, and desperate travelers. Sadie Jenkins sat at gate C-14, shivering in a worn denim jacket that offered no protection against the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. She rubbed her eyes, trying to erase the stinging exhaustion that came from working a 14-hour double shift at a greasy spoon diner in Logan Square, followed immediately by a frantic, tear-soaked subway ride to the airport. Her bank account was currently overdrawn by $12. Her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed, and her younger brother, Toby, was going to die if she didn't get to Las Vegas by morning. Toby had always been a mess of bad decisions and gambling addictions, but this time he had crossed an invisible, fatal line. A frantic voicemail left at 8 p.m. had outlined his sins. He owed $40,000 to the Sullivan crew, a vicious mid-level offshoot of the Irish mob operating out of the Vegas Strip. They had given him 24 hours to produce the cash, or they were going to start mailing pieces of him back to Chicago. Sadie didn't have $40,000. She didn't even have $400. But she had a maxed-out emergency credit card, a fierce protective instinct, and a delusional hope that she could beg for his life. Flight 488 to Las Vegas, now boarding all remaining groups. The intercom crackled, pulling Sadie from her spiraling panic. She shuffled onto the plane, her cheap canvas duffel bag banging against her hip. It was a packed, miserable red-eye. When she finally found her seat, 22B, a middle seat in the cramped coach section, she let out a quiet sigh of despair. The man sitting in the window seat, 22A, didn't belong in coach. He was staring out the window, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, shadowed by a faint, dark stubble. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed old money and dangerous power. Everything about him was rigid, controlled, and intensely intimidating. He exuded an aura that made the other passengers subconsciously give him a wide berth. He didn't look like a man flying economy to Vegas for a bachelor party. He looked like a man who owned the airline, but was hiding from a ghost. His name was Damian Rossi, though Sadie wouldn't know that until it was entirely too late. Damian was the newly ascended head of the Rossi Syndicate. He was flying commercial, buried in the middle of an overbooked domestic flight, entirely by design. The FBI had raided 2 of his private hangars an hour ago. There was a leak in his organization, a rat who had given the feds the tail numbers of his private jets. Taking a cheap commercial flight under the alias Arthur Sterling was the only way to get to Vegas to meet with his West Coast lieutenants before the federal freeze hit his assets. He was infuriated, exhausted, and running on purely violent adrenaline. Sadie slipped into the seat next to him, apologizing softly as she bumped his knee. Damian didn't look at her. He merely shifted his broad shoulders closer to the window, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the tarmac. The plane took off, ascending into the violent, turbulent skies over the Midwest. The cabin lights dimmed. Sadie tried to stay awake. She needed to formulate a plan. How do you negotiate with monsters? What could she possibly offer them? She rested her head back against the cheap synthetic leather of the seat. The rhythmic hum of the engines, combined with the sheer, crushing weight of her exhaustion, began to drag her under. Her head bobbed. She caught herself. It bobbed again. On the third nod, the plane hit a massive pocket of dead air. The cabin dropped abruptly. Sadie jolted, completely losing her equilibrium, and slumped heavily to her left. Her head landed squarely on Damien Ross's broad, suit-clad shoulder. Damien stiffened instantly. His right hand instinctively dropped toward his waist, a reflex honed from years of paranoia and assassination attempts, before he realized it was just the girl. He looked down. She was deeply asleep, her breathing soft and ragged. She smelled like cheap vanilla body wash and stale diner fries, a sharp contrast to the world of Tom Ford cologne and blood he was accustomed to. He should have shoved her off. He hated being touched. He despised the unpredictable proximity of strangers. He raised a hand to push her back into her own space, but he paused. There was a tear tracking down her pale cheek, catching the dim emergency aisle lighting. She looked incredibly fragile, entirely broken by whatever life she was leading. For a man who dealt in the currency of fear and leverage, her sheer vulnerability was an anomaly. Damien lowered his hand. He didn't push her away. Instead, he remained perfectly still as the plane carved its way toward the neon desert, allowing a stranger to use him as a lifeline in the dark. The jarring thud of the landing gear hitting the runway at Harry Reid International Airport woke Sadie with a violent start. She gasped, her eyes flying open. It took her 3 horrifying seconds to realize she was practically plastered to the side of the terrifying man in the window seat. Her drool had left a faint, damp spot on the shoulder of his immaculate suit jacket. "Oh my God!" Sadie scrambled backward, her face burning with a humiliation so hot she felt dizzy. "I am so sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just so tired. And the turbulence." Damien slowly turned his head to look at her. His expression was completely unreadable, a blank mask of cold authority. "Breathe," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "It's fine." It wasn't fine. She grabbed her canvas bag the second the seatbelt sign turned off, fleeing the plane as fast as the shuffling crowd allowed. She needed to get to the Golden Nugget Casino downtown. Toby had said they were holding him in one of the back alley motels near Fremont Street. Stepping out into the oppressive, dry heat of the Nevada night, Sadie hurried toward the taxi stand. The line was a mile long. She checked her phone. 2:14 a.m. Toby was running out of time. She paced frantically, biting her thumbnail down to the quick. "You're shaking," a voice noted from the shadows. Sadie spun around. Damien was standing a few feet away, a black leather travel bag slung over his shoulder. The harsh orange streetlights illuminated the sharp angles of his face. 2 men in dark suits had materialized beside him, looking like walking brick walls. "I'm in a hurry," Sadie stammered, intimidated by the sudden shift in his demeanor. On the plane, he was a silent stranger. Here, flanked by muscle, he looked like a predator in his own territory. "The taxi line will take an hour," Damien observed, his eyes scanning her frantic face. He didn't know why he was stopping. He had a syndicate to secure. But the tear he had seen on the plane nagged at the heavily guarded corners of his conscience. "Where are you going?" "Fremont Street," she blurted out, too desperate to care about stranger danger. "I need to get there right now. It's a matter of life and death." Damien stared at her for a long moment. He nodded toward a sleek, blacked-out SUV pulling up to the curb. "Get in. I can't afford a black car. I didn't ask for your money. Get in or wait an hour." Against every survival instinct she possessed, Sadie climbed into the back of the SUV. Damien slid in beside her. The partition rolled up, sealing them in an opulent, quiet bubble. As the car sped away from the airport, Sadie's anxiety finally boiled over. She started crying, silently at first, then with ragged sobs. "Who is going to die?" Damien asked quietly, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter built into the console. He handed her the glass. Sadie took it with shaking hands, downing the whiskey. It burned her throat, but it stopped the tears. "My brother, Toby. He owes $40,000 to some people. The Sullivans. They said if I don't bring the money by morning, they'll kill him." The temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. Damien leaned back, swirling his own drink. The Sullivans, a reckless, loud-mouthed crew that had been stepping on Rossi territory for the last 6 months. They were a nuisance he hadn't had the time to squash. "And you have this 40,000? Damien asked. "I have $12, Sadie confessed, a broken laugh escaping her lips. "I was going to beg, offer to work it off, whatever it takes." "They don't take payment plans," Damien said coldly. "They will kill him, and then they will traffic you to recoup the loss." Sadie turned completely pale. The glass slipped from her fingers, thudding onto the plush carpet. The SUV pulled into a dark alleyway behind a glowing neon sign off Fremont Street. "Stay here," Damien commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No, I have to go in there. If you go in there, you both die. Wait." Damien stepped out of the vehicle. His 2 bodyguards flanked him. Sadie watched through the tinted glass as they kicked open the heavy metal back door of the building. For 10 agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then, a muffled shout. The distinct, terrifying crack of 3 gunshots. Sadie screamed, throwing her hands over her ears. A moment later, the metal door opened again. Damien walked out, his suit entirely unruffled, though his knuckles were visibly bruised. Behind him, one of his men was dragging a bruised, bloody, and terrified Toby by the collar of his shirt. They tossed Toby onto the pavement. Sadie threw open the door and scrambled out, falling to her knees beside her brother. "Toby, oh my God, are you okay?" "Sadie," Toby choked out, spitting blood. "How? Who are these guys?" Damien looked down at them, a god standing over mortals. "Your debt to the Sullivans is cancelled," Damien stated, his voice echoing in the alley, "because the Sullivans no longer operate in this city." Sadie stared up at him in absolute horror and awe. "What did you do?" "I saved your brother's life," Damien said. "But in my world, blood pays for blood. Toby's debt isn't gone, it just transferred to me." "I'll pay you," Toby cried, scrambling backward. "I swear, Mr. Rossi, I'll get the money." Sadie froze. Rossi. She watched the news. She knew who the Rossi family was. The Chicago Syndicate, the Mafia. She had fallen asleep on the shoulder of a mob boss. Damien ignored Toby, his eyes locking solely on Sadie. He needed a brilliant PR move to distract the feds. He needed an airtight alibi, someone who couldn't be compelled to testify against him under the spousal privilege laws, someone clean, with no ties to the underworld, to hold his clean assets while the FBI tore through his dirty ones. The thought was insane, impulsive, and entirely uncharacteristic. But as he looked at the fiercely loyal, desperate girl shivering in the alley, the plan cemented in his mind. "I don't want his money," Damien said, stepping closer to Sadie, his presence suffocating. "I want you." "What?" Sadie whispered. "Get back in the car, Sadie." The transition from the blood-stained alley to the penthouse of the Bellagio was a blur of adrenaline, trauma, and top-shelf champagne. Sadie remembered fragmented moments, the terrifying silence in the SUV, Toby being thrown into a separate car with a promise that he would be put on a bus to nowhere, and Damien pouring her glass after glass of vintage Krug in a private, soundproofed room. She remembered him speaking in a low, hypnotic cadence. He had explained a terrifying logic. Her brother was a liability. The Sullivans' associates would eventually look for revenge. Toby was dead walking, and Sadie was a target by association. But if she belonged to Damien Rossi, if she was his wife, no one in the criminal underworld would ever dare look at her or her bloodline twice. She would have absolute protection. Toby would live. In exchange, she would provide Damien with a legal shield against an impending federal indictment, signing a mountain of ironclad non-disclosure agreements and prenuptials. It was a transaction. A life for a life. She remembered crying. She remembered a man in a cheap suit reading vows under a flickering fluorescent light in a chapel off the Strip. She remembered the cold metal sliding onto her finger. And now, she was waking up in his bed. Sadie stared at the Glock on the nightstand, her breathing shallow. She looked back at Damien, who was sitting in the velvet armchair. He was no longer in the bespoke suit. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a network of dark, intricate tattoos creeping up his forearms. "You're awake," he stated, his voice devoid of the hypnotic charm he had used hours ago. It was back to cold, hard business. "Did we?" Sadie's voice cracked. She pulled the black silk sheets up to her chin, her eyes darting frantically around the room. "Did we consummate?" Damien asked bluntly, taking a sip of his espresso. "No. I don't take advantage of terrified, intoxicated women. You slept. I made phone calls." Sadie looked down at the massive diamond on her finger. "Is this a joke? Is this a nightmare?" "It is a legal reality," Damien said, standing up. He walked over to the bed, picking up the golden certificate from the nightstand and tossing it onto her lap. "Signed, sealed, and filed at the county clerk's office 3 hours ago. You are Sadie Rossi." "I can't be a Mafia wife," Sadie burst out, the panic finally breaking through the shock. She scrambled out of the bed, realizing she was wearing one of his oversized dress shirts. "I work at a diner. I have a cat. I can't be involved in whatever you do. You killed people last night." "I removed an obstacle," Damien corrected smoothly. "And as of this morning, the FBI has frozen $50 million of my assets and subpoenaed half of my associates. They are looking for a weakness. They are looking for leverage." He stepped closer, backing her into the edge of the mattress. The sheer size of him, the predatory grace, made her breath hitch. "But they cannot compel a wife to testify against her husband," Damien continued, his eyes locked on hers. "And they cannot seize the clean trust fund I transferred into your maiden name at 4 a.m. You are going to smile for the cameras. You are going to wear my ring. You are going to live in my house in Chicago. And you are going to play the part of a devoted wife who tamed the beast." "And if I refuse?" she whispered, trembling. "If I walk out that door right now?" Damien reached out, his large, calloused hand gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was startlingly tender, a terrifying contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. "If you walk out that door," Damien said softly, "Toby loses the protection of my name. The remnants of the Sullivan crew will find him by Tuesday, and the feds will throw you in a concrete cell for conspiracy to launder money, because your signature is already on the trust documents." Sadie stared at him, trapped in a cage of gold and blood. She had boarded a plane to save her brother, and she had sold her soul to the devil at 30,000 feet. "How long?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes again. "How long do I have to pretend?" "Until the feds drop the case," Damien replied, turning away to pick up his gun. He expertly checked the chamber, before sliding it into a shoulder holster. A year, maybe 2. You will want for nothing, Sadie. You'll have money, clothes, security. It's a better life than the one you left at that airport. It's a prison, she shot back bitterly. Damien paused at the door of the bedroom, looking back at her over his shoulder. A strange, unreadable shadow passed over his features. Perhaps, he murmured, but I'm the only warden who can keep you alive. Get dressed, Mrs. Rossi. Our private jet leaves in an hour. We have to go home and convince Chicago that we're madly in love. The private flight back to Chicago was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Sadie sat strapped into a plush, cream-colored leather seat aboard a Gulfstream G65. Oh, watching the Nevada desert give way to the sprawling, grid-like expanse of the Midwest. Damien sat opposite her, buried in encrypted tablets and burner phones, dismantling his compromised assets piece by piece. They landed at a private airstrip just outside the city. A motorcade of armored Cadillac Escalades was waiting. "Listen to me," Damien said, breaking the silence as the convoy merged onto the I-94, heading north towards the affluent suburb of Lake Forest. "My organization is a snake pit. The men who work for me respect only 2 things: power and loyalty. If they smell fear on you, if they suspect this marriage is a sham orchestrated to protect my assets, they will exploit it. You are no longer Sadie Jenkins, the diner waitress. You are Sadie Rossi, the woman who cornered the head of the Chicago syndicate." Sadie gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white. "I don't know how to be that person." "You learn," Damien replied coldly, though his eyes lingered on her pale face. "You showed backbone in the alley with the Sullivans. Channel that." The Rossi estate was a fortress disguised as a 1920s Tudor mansion, nestled on 4 acres of pristine, heavily wooded land overlooking Lake Michigan. 12-foot wrought-iron gates swung open to reveal a sprawling gravel driveway, meticulously manicured hedges, and armed men patrolling the perimeter with discreet earpieces. When the heavy oak front doors opened, Sadie stepped into a foyer constructed entirely of imported Carrara marble. It was breathtakingly beautiful and entirely lifeless. Waiting for them in the grand hall was a man in his late 50s, sporting a tailored navy suit and a silver streak through his slicked-back hair. His smile was predatory. This was Victor, Damien's uncle, and the syndicate's most senior capo. "Damien," Victor said, spreading his arms, though his eyes were fixed on Sadie with the warmth of a morgue slab. "We expected you to return with blood on your hands, not a ring on your finger. And who is this lovely distraction?" "My wife," Damien answered, his voice echoing off the marble. He didn't hesitate. He placed a heavy, possessive hand on the small of Sadie's back, pulling her flush against his side. The sudden physical contact sent a jolt of electricity through her spine, but she remembered his warning. "Don't show fear." "Sadie," Damien continued smoothly. "This is Victor. He handles the waterfront logistics." Victor's smile tightened. "A wife? A secret Vegas wedding, while the feds are tearing through our North Side warehouses? It's awfully convenient, nephew. Some of the men might think you're panicking." Damien took a slow, measured step forward, forcing Victor to subtly tilt his head up. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. "Some of the men should remember what happened to the last person who questioned my judgment," Damien said, his tone lethally soft. "Sadie holds the keys to the new trust. She is untouchable. Disrespect her, and you disrespect me." Victor held his hands up in mock surrender. "Just looking out for the family, boss. Welcome to Chicago, Mrs. Rossi." Over the next 48 hours, Sadie was stripped of her former life. Her cheap denim and synthetic work uniforms were burned. A team of high-end stylists was brought into the estate. Her closet was filled with Tom Ford outerwear, Chanel tweeds, and Oscar de la Renta evening gowns. Her bank account, previously overdrawn by $12, now reflected a checking balance of $2.5 million, the walking around money attached to her new, heavily guarded alias. But the clothes and the money were just chains made of gold. She was confined to the estate. Everywhere she walked, a massive, silent bodyguard named Declan followed 2 steps behind. On the 3rd night, Sadie couldn't sleep. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow, terrifying reality in its wake. She wandered down to the massive chef's kitchen at 2 a.m., wearing a silk robe, desperate for a glass of water. She froze in the doorway. Damien was sitting at the vast granite island, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, staring at a mountain of financial ledgers. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight with stress. He was a monster, she knew that. A man who dealt in violence. But in the dim light of the under-cabinet LEDs, he just looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Can't sleep?" he asked, not looking up. "It's hard to sleep in a museum," Sadie murmured, stepping into the room. She poured herself a glass of water, acutely aware of how quiet the house was. "Toby called me from a burner phone today. He's safe in Montana. He got a job at a logging camp." "Good," Damien said, closing a ledger. "He stays off the grid. He stays alive." Sadie took a breath. "Thank you. For that, at least." Damien finally looked up. His icy blue eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the armor she had been trying to build. "Don't thank me, Sadie. This isn't a charity. It's a transaction. Tomorrow night is the St. Jude Charity Gala at the Drake Hotel. The mayor will be there. The governor will be there. And the FBI will be there, waiting for us to slip up. We need to put on a show." "What kind of show?" "The kind where you look at me like I'm the only man in the room," Damien said, standing up. He closed the distance between them, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was burning hot. "The kind where everyone believes I would burn this city down before I let anyone touch you. Can you do that?" Sadie swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. The terrifying truth was, when he looked at her like that, she didn't think she would have to act at all. "I can do it," she whispered. The Drake Hotel was a beacon of old-world Chicago money, its grand ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with white orchids. The guest list was a volatile mix of high society, corrupt politicians, and organized crime masquerading as legitimate business. When Damien and Sadie stepped out of their armored Maybach, camera flashes erupted like a war zone. Sadie wore a breathtaking, floor-length emerald silk gown that clung to her curves, a staggering diamond collar around her neck. Damien looked like a devastatingly handsome villain in a bespoke black tuxedo, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. "Smile," he murmured against her ear, his breath sending a shiver down her neck. "You're the queen of the city tonight." They navigated the ballroom floor flawlessly. Damien introduced her to senators and judges, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. Whenever someone asked about their sudden nuptials, Damien would look down at Sadie with such profound, fabricated adoration that it made her chest physically ache. He was an incredible actor. He touched her constantly, a hand on her knee under the table, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, leaning in to whisper inside jokes that were actually just instructions on who to avoid. But the illusion shattered an hour into the dinner. Sadie excused herself to the powder room. Declan, her ever-present shadow, waited by the heavy brass doors in the hallway. Inside the opulent marble bathroom, Sadie leaned against the sink, taking a deep breath to steady her racing heart. It's an impressive performance, Miss Jenkins. Or should I say, Mrs. Rossi? Sadie whipped around. A man in a sharp, off-the-rack grey suit was leaning against the bathroom stalls. He held up a gold badge. "Special Agent Reynolds, FBI," he said smoothly. "You're a long way from the diner in Logan Square." "You aren't supposed to be in here," Sadie said, keeping her voice steady, though her hands began to shake. "I'm investigating a federal racketeering case. I go where I want," Reynolds sneered, stepping closer. "We know it's a sham, Sadie. We know Damian Rossi doesn't fall in love. We know about the $50 million he transferred into a trust under your name 4 hours before our raid. You are aiding and abetting a known domestic terrorist." "I have nothing to say to you without my husband's lawyers present," Sadie recited, exactly as Damian had trained her. Reynolds laughed harshly. "Your husband is going to prison for the rest of his natural life, and unless you cooperate, you're going with him. Tell me where the offshore ledgers are. Give me something, and I'll put you in witness protection. Refuse, and I'll make sure they lock you up in a cell so deep you'll forget what the sun looks like." "Are you threatening my wife, Agent Reynolds?" The temperature in the bathroom plummeted to absolute 0. Damian stood in the doorway. Declan was behind him, holding a very unconscious hotel security guard by the collar. Damian's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated lethal intent. He stepped into the bathroom, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. "Rossi," Reynolds said, taking a step back, his bravado slipping. "I was just having a conversation with the bride." "You're harassing a civilian in a women's restroom," Damian said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He walked past Reynolds, completely ignoring the federal agent, and wrapped his arm around Sadie. He pulled her flush against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. Sadie clung to his tuxedo jacket, her hands trembling violently. Damian finally turned his dead, ice-blue eyes onto the agent. "If you ever approach my wife alone again, if you ever speak her name, if you even look at her shadow on the pavement, I will not send my lawyers. I will come for you myself. Do you understand me?" Reynolds swallowed hard, staring at the monster the FBI had been trying to cage for a decade. He nodded once, stiffly, and pushed past them out the door. Once they were alone, the silence in the bathroom was deafening. Sadie was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Damian didn't let her go. For the first time, his embrace didn't feel like a possessive performance for an audience. It felt fiercely, genuinely protective. "Did he touch you?" Damian asked, his voice rough. "No," Sadie breathed into his chest. "I did what you said. I didn't tell him anything." Damian pulled back slightly, looking down into her terrified eyes. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb sweeping away a tear she hadn't realized she shed. "You did perfectly." Before Sadie could process the softness in his eyes, Declan burst into the bathroom, his radio squawking frantically. "Boss!" Declan barked, drawing his concealed weapon. "We have a massive problem. The valet area is compromised. 3 black SUVs just rolled up. They aren't feds. They're armed." Damian's demeanor snapped back to cold steel in a millisecond. "Victor." "Looks like it," Declan confirmed grimly. He timed his coup with the gala. He knew we'd be distracted by the FBI presence. "They're going to trap us in the lobby," Damian said, drawing his own Glock 19 from beneath his tuxedo jacket. He turned to Sadie, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully. You stay behind Declan. You do not stop running until you are in the armored car. Do you understand?" "Damian, what is happening?" she cried, panic clawing at her throat. "My uncle is trying to kill me, and he's going to use you to do it. Damien said, his jaw locked. He looked at her, and for a split second, the impenetrable Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man who looked terrified of losing something he didn't know he wanted. "I won't let him take you, I promise." He grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. "Let's go." They burst out of the bathroom, plunging straight into the chaos of a mafia, civil war exploding in the heart of Chicago high society. The transition from high society elegance to absolute carnage happened in the span of 3 breathless seconds. As Damien, Sadie, and Declan burst from the corridor into the grand foyer of the Drake Hotel, the heavy brass doors of the Palm Court shattered inward. A storm of suppressed gunfire chewed through the imported marble pillars and shredded the cascading floral arrangements. Screams from Chicago's elite echoed off the vaulted ceilings as socialites in Oscar de la Renta, gowns and politicians in bespoke tuxedos dove beneath velvet-draped banquet tables. "Get down!" Damien roared over the deafening crack of shattered glass, his hand wrapping like a vice around Sadie's wrist. He yanked her behind a massive, overturned mahogany bar cart, just as a line of bullets stitched across the wall where they had been standing a microsecond before. Sadie hit the floor hard, the breath rushing from her lungs. The emerald silk of her gown dragged through spilled champagne and shattered crystal. She curled into a tight ball, her hands covering her ears, trembling violently. This wasn't a movie. The smell of cordite and copper was suffocatingly real, burning the back of her throat. "Declan, sit rep!" Damien barked, his Glock 19 already drawn. He didn't look like a man cornered. He looked like a general analyzing a battlefield. His tuxedo jacket was pulled tight across his broad shoulders, his blue eyes cold and calculating as he peered around the edge of the mahogany cart. 4 shooters at the main Michigan Avenue entrance. Declan grunted, slamming a fresh magazine into his weapon. He was bleeding from a superficial graze on his cheek. "Victor's personal guard. They've locked the revolving doors with zip ties. They are sweeping the lobby. We're cut off from the armored cars." "They aren't trying to capture me," Damien stated, his jaw locked in a rigid line. "Victor wants a public execution to prove I'm weak. He's using the FBI's presence as a smoke screen." "What do we do?" Sadie gasped, her voice barely a squeak over the chaos. She looked up at Damien, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Damien looked down at her. Amidst the gunfire and the screaming, the world seemed to violently contract until it was just the 2 of them behind the barricade. He reached out, his large, warm hand cupping the side of her face. His thumb smeared a drop of someone else's blood off her cheekbone. "We do not die today, Sadie," Damien said, his voice a low, vibrating promise that bypassed her panic and anchored her to the floor. "I brought you into this nightmare. I will walk you out of it. Do exactly as I say." He turned back to his bodyguard. "Declan, suppressing fire on the right flank. We are moving through the service corridors to the subterranean kitchens. We take the freight elevator down to the lower Wacker Drive service tunnels. Go." Declan nodded, rolling out from behind the cart and unleashing a deafening volley of return fire. "Move!" Damien commanded. He hauled Sadie to her feet, shielding her body entirely with his own as they sprinted across the open expanse of the lobby. Bullets whizzed past them like angry hornets, biting into the plush carpeting and exploding the plaster statues of roaring lions. Sadie ran blindly, her high heels abandoned somewhere near the coat check. She felt the concussive force of a bullet slamming into the wall mere inches from her head, showering her with white dust. They crashed through a set of swinging metallic doors, leaving the opulent, blood-stained lobby behind, and entering the sterile, stainless steel labyrinth of the hotel's industrial kitchens. The air here was thick with the smell of roasted duck and panic. The culinary staff had already fled. "Keep moving." Damien urged, pushing her past massive convection ovens and rows of hanging copper pots. But as they rounded the corner toward the freight elevator, the heavy metallic doors hissed open. Standing inside, flanking a terrified, bleeding Special Agent Reynolds, was Victor. He held a silver, pearl-handled revolver, leveled directly at Damien's chest. 4 more of his heavily armed men stepped out of the elevator, cutting off their only escape route. Declan skidded to a halt beside them, raising his weapon, but they were hopelessly outgunned. "Nephew," Victor said smoothly, his voice echoing off the stainless steel walls. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, looking entirely unbothered by the massacre he had just orchestrated upstairs. "You always were too predictable. I knew you'd head for the tunnels." "You brought the feds into a family dispute, Victor?" Damien asked, his voice deadly calm. He didn't raise his gun, but his body was coiled like a spring. He subtly shifted his weight, ensuring he was entirely blocking Sadie from Victor's line of sight. "The FBI is a tool, Damien, just like this little waitress you picked up in Vegas," Victor sneered, gesturing lazily with his revolver. He shoved Agent Reynolds forward. The federal agent looked pale and furious, entirely out of his depth. "Reynolds here was more than happy to look the other way while I cleared house, provided I hand over the syndicate's financial ledgers. A mutually beneficial arrangement." "You're a dead man, Victor," Damien stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Victor laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "No, Damien, you are. You got soft. You let a pretty face distract you when the feds were at your door. You married a civilian to protect your money, and in doing so, you proved to the families that you care more about your bank accounts than the blood of the syndicate. Kill him. But leave the girl alive. She has the signatures I need to access the trust." Victor's men raised their rifles. Time seemed to fracture. Sadie, fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline and street-forged survival instinct, didn't cower. She saw a heavy, industrial canister of pressurized cooking oil sitting on the prep table next to a lit, open-flame gas burner. Without thinking, she lunged around Damien, grabbed the canister, and hurled it directly onto the open flame before diving to the floor. "Sadie, no!" Damien roared. The explosion was catastrophic. The pressurized oil ignited in a blinding fireball of superheated gas and shrapnel, instantly engulfing the immediate space between them and Victor's men. The shockwave threw Damien and Sadie backward against the steel refrigerators. Screams filled the kitchen as 2 of Victor's men caught the brunt of the blast, dropping their weapons. Through the thick, acrid black smoke, Damien didn't hesitate. He rose like a demon from the ash, his Glock firing in rapid, precise succession. 2 sharp cracks. 2 of Victor's remaining men dropped. Victor, coughing and temporarily blinded by the smoke, wildly fired his silver revolver through the haze. Sadie heard the sickening, wet thud of a bullet finding its mark. Damien staggered, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth as his left shoulder violently jerked back. Blood instantly bloomed, a dark, spreading stain against the pristine white of his tuxedo shirt. "Damien!" Sadie screamed, scrambling toward him over the slick, debris-covered tiles. Before Victor could fire again, Declan emerged from the smoke, tackling the older man to the ground. The pearl-handled revolver skittered across the floor. Agent Reynolds, seeing his opportunity, scrambled away into the stairwell, abandoning his corrupt alliance. Damien dropped to one knee, his right hand still clutching his weapon, his chest heaving. Sadie slid to a halt beside him, her hands frantically pressing against the wound on his shoulder. Hot, slick blood immediately coated her fingers. "I'm fine," Damien gritted out, his face pale, his jaw clenched in absolute agony. He looked at the wreckage of the kitchen, at Victor pinned beneath Declan, and then finally at Sadie. his cold, untouchable facade shattered completely. He stared at her, breathing heavily, awe warring with fury in his eyes. "You threw a bomb." "I work in a kitchen," Sadie sobbed, pressing harder on the wound, her tears mingling with the ash on her face. "I know what happens when you leave grease on the stove. We have to get you out of here. You're bleeding everywhere." Damien let out a breathless, painful laugh. He leaned his forehead against hers, the world around them burning. "You are magnificent, Mrs. Rossi." The clandestine medical suite was buried 3 stories beneath the concrete foundation of a legitimate shipping logistics company in the South Loop. It was a sterile, unforgiving room that smelled sharply of industrial antiseptic, rubbing alcohol, and strong bleach, a stark and jarring contrast to the opulent, floral-scented ballroom of the Drake Hotel they had just fled. Sadie sat rigid on a hard, molded plastic chair in the far corner, her knees pulled tightly together. Her breathtaking emerald silk gown, which had made her feel like a queen only hours ago, was now ruined, stiff, dark, and heavy with drying blood. She stared blankly at her trembling hands, her mind relentlessly replaying the deafening roar of the pressurized oil canister exploding, the heat of the fire, and the terrifying wet sound of a bullet tearing through flesh. Across the small room, harsh fluorescent lights beat down mercilessly on a cold stainless steel examination table. Damien sat on the edge of it, his broad chest bare, his skin pale from blood loss, but his posture as unyielding as ever. Dr. Harrison Powell, a disgraced former trauma surgeon whose crippling gambling debts kept him permanently and exclusively retained by the Rossi Syndicate, worked with grim, silent efficiency. He was finishing the final agonizing stitches on the jagged, angry gunshot wound in Damien's left shoulder. Damien hadn't asked for painkillers. He hadn't even flinched when the doctor had dug the deformed lead bullet out of his torn muscle with cold metal forceps. He simply stared straight ahead, his expression carved from unreadable granite, his jaw locked tight enough to shatter teeth. Every time the surgical needle pierced his skin, the heavy muscles of his chest and abdomen flexed in silent protest. But no sound escaped his lips. Sadie watched him from the shadows of the corner, her heart aching with a confusing, turbulent mix of terror, residual adrenaline, and an undeniable magnetic pull. This man was a monster, a ruthless kingpin who orchestrated violence and manipulation as easily as breathing. Yet, when the moment had demanded it, he had thrown himself in front of a bullet that would have otherwise ended her life. When Dr. Powell finally taped a thick, white gauze bandage over the sutured wound, he packed his bloody stainless steel instruments into a black leather bag. He didn't offer any post-operative advice. He simply gave a curt, respectful nod to Damien, kept his eyes entirely averted from Sadie, and quietly slipped out of the reinforced steel door. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking from the outside echoed loudly in the confined space, sealing them in. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't the performative silence of the private jet or the tense, guarded quiet of the Lake Forest mansion. It was the raw, exhausted aftermath of survival, stripped of all pretense and armor. Sadie finally looked up, dragging her gaze from her blood-stained cuticles. Damien was already watching her. He swung his legs off the examination table, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his newly stitched flesh, and reached for a clean black t-shirt folded on a nearby tray. He pulled it over his head with careful, calculated movements. He walked over to her, his steps stiff but purposeful. He knelt directly in front of her plastic chair, entirely ignoring the searing pain that must have been radiating through his shoulder, and took her small, cold hands in his large, calloused ones. "It's over," Damien said quietly, his low baritone voice raspy from the smoke and shouting. Sadie swallowed hard, trying to push past the lump of pure anxiety in her throat. "Is Victor dead?" she whispered, her voice hollow and trembling. "No. He is currently sitting in a federal holding cell," Damien replied smoothly, his thumb beginning to gently stroke the back of her knuckles in a rhythmic, grounding motion. When the police tactical units arrived at the hotel, they found him trapped in the lower levels. He was surrounded by dead men, illegal firearms, and a terrified FBI agent who was very, very eager to cut a plea deal to save his own miserable career. Reynolds sang. He told the Bureau absolutely everything about Victor's little coup and the corruption that funded it. Sadie frowned, her exhausted brain struggling to process the complex web of information. The adrenaline crash was making her thoughts sluggish. But the $50 million, the trust fund you put in my name to protect your assets from the raid? If Victor takes the fall, what happens to the money? A dark, dangerous, and incredibly predatory smile played at the corner of Damien's mouth, entirely transforming his bruised face. "There was no trust fund in your name, Sadie." Sadie stared at him, stunned into absolute stillness, her breath caught in her lungs. "What?" "The documents you signed in Las Vegas were real marriage certificates, but the financial transfers were a decoy. A shell game," Damien explained softly, his eyes locked onto hers with a frightening intensity. "I knew Victor was planning to make a move against me. I knew he was leaking critical information to the feds to weaken my position and force a panic. So, I let him think he had won. I transferred the $50 million into a series of highly complex offshore accounts that were covertly registered under Victor's aliases. When the FBI raided my warehouses yesterday, they found an anonymous tip pointing them directly to those exact accounts." Sadie's breath hitched, a cold sensation washing over her skin. "You set him up." "I removed a cancer from my organization," Damien corrected, his voice entirely devoid of remorse. "By tomorrow morning, the federal prosecutor will freeze all of Victor's assets. He will go to a maximum security prison for racketeering, conspiracy, and attempting to murder a federal agent. The heat on my faction will vanish entirely, absorbed by his downfall." Sadie slowly pulled her hands back, slipping them out of his grasp. The cold realization was sinking deep into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. "So," she began, her voice shaking as she pieced the puzzle together. "You didn't need me. The sudden marriage, the lavish trust, the performance at the gala. It was all just a distraction, so Victor would focus his crosshairs on me instead of looking at your real plan." She stood up abruptly, her legs shaking so badly she almost stumbled. She wrapped her arms tightly around her own waist, suddenly feeling incredibly foolish, used, and impossibly small. She had blown up a kitchen, risked her life, and terrified herself to her core for a man who had manipulated her from the very second she accidentally fell asleep on his shoulder. "Toby is safe in Montana," she recited, her voice cracking as the tears finally spilled over her lashes. "The Sullivans are gone. Victor is in jail. The transaction is complete, right? You got what you wanted. You can annul the marriage now. I can go back to Chicago, or wherever. I'll disappear. You'll never have to see me again." Damien stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over her in the harsh fluorescent light of the clinic. The dangerous, calculating mob boss who had just orchestrated the flawless destruction of his own uncle was gone. In his place was a man who looked violently possessive, desperately unanchored, and utterly terrified of the words coming out of her mouth. He closed the short distance between them in 2 long strides, trapping her against the cold concrete wall. His hands came to rest flat against the wall on either side of her head, caging her in, though he was careful not to let his weight press against her. "No," Damien said, his voice a ragged, desperate whisper that seemed to echo in her chest. "Damien, please." "I told myself it was a strategic move," Damien confessed, cutting her off. His ice-blue eyes were burning into hers, stripped of all their usual icy defenses. "When I saw you crying on that plane, I told myself I was just acquiring a useful asset, a clean name, a beautiful distraction for my uncle to underestimate. But then you stood in that filthy alley and demanded to die for a brother who didn't deserve a fraction of your loyalty. You stood in a ballroom full of wolves and politicians, and you didn't flinch. You threw a firebomb at a squad of heavily armed men to save my life." He leaned closer, his forehead coming to rest gently against hers. His breathing was heavy, uneven, and incredibly warm against her tear-stained skin. "I am a man who deals exclusively in control, Sadie. I dictate every variable. But from the exact moment you fell asleep on my shoulder, I haven't had a single drop of it. I don't want an annulment. I don't want you to leave. The transaction is over. The strategy is done." "This is real." Sadie looked up into his eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She searched his face for the lie, for the manipulation, for the cold tactician she knew he was. But she found only a raw, desperate truth. The man who ruled the Chicago underworld with an iron fist, the man who terrified federal agents and crushed rebellions, was completely, entirely at her mercy. She slowly reached up, her small, trembling hands resting gently against the center of his chest. She could feel the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart beneath the soft cotton of his shirt, beating just as wildly as her own. She had boarded a flight out of absolute purgatory to save a life, and through a baptism of fire and blood, she had somehow become the queen of an empire. "You're a monster, Damien Rossi," Sadie whispered, a soft, broken, and incredibly genuine smile finally touching her lips. "I know," he murmured, his large hands leaving the wall to pull her flush against his body, entirely ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his wounded shoulder. "But I'm yours." He kissed her, and the impact was immediate and overwhelming. It felt exactly like the explosion in the kitchen, violent, all-consuming, and utterly impossible to survive unchanged. She tangled her fingers in his dark hair, pulling him closer, surrendering to the heat and the chaos. As his hand slid down to grip her waist, the heavy golden ring on her left hand caught the harsh fluorescent light. It was no longer a symbol of captivity, no longer a chain tying her to a debt. It was a crown. Sadie's journey from a desperate, exhausted waitress on a turbulent red-eye flight to the undisputed, fearless queen of the Chicago underworld proves that the most profound transformations are often born from chaos. Damien Rossi sought a temporary shield against his enemies, but instead he found an equal partner who challenged his absolute control and saved his life when his empire crumbled around him. Their story is a thrilling testament to loyalty, survival, and the unpredictable nature of love when forged in the fires of danger.